Okay, I'm back. So let's go on with these theories of the resurrection. Um, so the second one is that Joseph of Arimathea never buried him. So what evidence do we have against that? Well, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary, who's possibly or maybe even probably Jesus' mother, were there. That's 3 gospel accounts tell us that. They later went back to the tomb. Why would they go back if Jesus had never buried him? Why would they go to a tomb if Jesus was never buried? Clearly, they expected Jesus to be in that tomb. Secondly, if the religious leaders were so concerned about his body being stolen, don't you think they would have checked to make sure it was there before securing the grave? Why would Joseph, but thirdly, why would Joseph do it? Not even the disciples, though, not even those closest to Jesus, realized or understood or expected him to rise from the dead. How could Joseph have known such information? The third one is the disciples stole the body. I love this one. I call it the Weekend at Bernie's theory. Don't watch the movie, but it's about 2 young guys that get invited to their boss's beach house for the weekend. When they get there, they find him dead, so they dress him up, they carry him around with them on all the fun things they're doing, so that nobody will know that he's dead and they can still have their fun weekend. So how do we know then that they didn't carry the body away? Well, first of all, fishermen getting past Roman guards. And Pilate said, make it as secure as you know how. It was very well secured with a Roman guard, which had several groups of guards that would take turns guarding the tomb while others rested. So this isn't a case of everyone falling asleep. It's impossible for that to have happened. And then how would they have carried him through the streets of Jerusalem with nobody noticing? This dead guy, that this body was being carried throughout the street. But more importantly, after Jesus died, these guys were wimps. They were cowards. Do you really think that they would risk being killed at this point by faking a resurrection? No. They were cowering for their lives. And finally, they didn't know to fake a resurrection. They didn't know that they should steal the body to make it look like he had risen. We're told that they didn't understand Jesus' teaching, that he would rise. Their complete surprise at his resurrection proves that. And John tells us as much in John 20, verse 9. Finally, the other disciple who had reached the tomb first, that's John. He never refers to himself. You may remember from last year, he never refers to himself by name, and he's also kind of sticking it into the ribs of Peter by saying, remember, we raced and I won. Finally, the other disciple who had reached the tomb first also went inside the tomb. He saw and believed. What did he believe? Because the next thing it says is, they still did not understand from Scripture that Jesus had to rise from the dead. Then the disciples went back to where they were staying. So, first of all, he saw and believed means he believed that they were right. The body's not there. He's missing. That's what he believed. He believed the women, who were obviously not good witnesses because they were women, or at least that's what was believed at that time. But he's not saying he believed Jesus resurrected, because it immediately says, but they didn't understand. They didn't understand from Scripture that Jesus had to rise from the dead. And then, I mean, if they had believed that he rose from the dead, they'd go tell the news, right? But no, they didn't. They went back to where they were staying, like, great, now the body's gone. So, obviously, that everyone involved had a vested interest in finding the body. But they didn't know. They didn't know to fake a resurrection. And even if they could have pulled it off, they didn't even know they should try to fake a resurrection. I love telling this story at this point. My mother, later in her life, was diagnosed with macular degeneration, which is you lose your eyesight, and she lost a lot of her eyesight over the course of her last couple years. But my mother was, I wish you all could have known my mother. My mother was the most insanely positive person I have ever met. And she almost always was cheerful and happy and kind and just an amazing woman. But this was really big news. And so she was going to a specialist, a doctor that she had not seen before. And she told my younger sister, one of my younger sisters, the name of the doctor. And she said, "Oh, I went to him when I was in college. And I was really mad at you for not telling me that he was cute, because I would have gotten dressed up and looked better if he was cute, if I would have known he was cute." So we're thinking about this and talking about this on the way there. And we go, and I'm sitting, and my mom's in the chair, and I'm looking out in the hallway, and there's a doctor in the hallway. And he's about this tall, and he's kind of pudgy. He's bald. He's got a gray ponytail, though, in the back, and he's got eyeglasses on. I'm like, I don't think that's the guy my sister saw 20 years ago. And so he walks in, and he begins to tell my mother some things that nobody would ever want to hear. Things like, well, you have macular degeneration. Your right eye is worse than your left eye. You're losing your eyesight. And we're going to treat the left eye, or the right eye. Now, that's the worse eye, but it may one day become your better eye. And so we're going to treat the right eye first, and then the left eye. And my mom is listening to these things that are just, I'm in the corner, like crying. And my mom is going, yes, doctor. Yes, I understand. I trust you, doctor. He must have thought she was nuts. But I know what was going on in her brain. She's looking at him and she's saying, yes. And in her brain she's thinking, if you took 20 years off of him and you took away the ponytail, gave him some hair back, might he be good looking? He might be, who knows? Now it turns out it was his brother that my sister had seen all those years ago. But my mom just didn't get it. She was receiving a message. He was telling her things, but she wasn't receiving that message. She wasn't understanding that message. That's the disciples. They didn't understand what Jesus was saying. They were clueless much of the time. And so they wouldn't have known to fake a resurrection. They wouldn't have stolen the body. And then there's the theory of the Jews or the Romans stole the body. This solves the problem of the armed guards. They could have gotten past the armed guards. But why would they want to do it? The guards were there to prevent that very thing, and it was the Jews that asked the Romans to do it. The Jews were the ones that started the whole somebody stole the body theory, so they wouldn't have done it themselves. They had a vested interest in finding that body, and had they found it, if they had it, they certainly would have produced it. So that doesn't make sense. Lastly, there's the twin theory, which we've talked about quite a bit in class, that someone other than Jesus died on the cross, whether that was an actual twin or someone who looked a lot like him. And we've talked about the reasons why that can't be true. But some Muslims, I bring it up now because some Muslims believe that. So finally, when people have nothing else to grasp onto, they say this: look, we don't know how it happened. We don't know how they did it. We don't know who did it. But it was an elaborate hoax, and the disciples knew it. So I want to read to you a little bit from this book, Loving God, which is by Charles Colson, who was the founder of Prison Fellowship. He came to be a believer either just before or while he was in prison. And then he started this largest, probably in the nation, maybe in the world, prison ministry because of that. He was the legal counsel to President Nixon during Watergate. Now, hopefully you know something about Watergate. I lived through it. I was a very young girl, but I do remember it. So let me just give you it in a nutshell. President Nixon was up for re-election. He was worried about the Democrats. Shouldn't have been worried about the Democrat. He won by a landslide, even with these murmurs of Watergate going on. The term Watergate refers to at that point a really new swanky hotel on the Potomac River called Watergate, and it's kind of like these half circles. It's really interesting looking building or buildings. So the Democratic headquarters was in Watergate. So Nixon had these people, or his henchmen. I'm not sure when Nixon found out about it. Certainly after they were caught. He found out about it, but his henchmen had these guys break into the Democratic headquarters to see if they could get any secrets, and they got caught. Now, if it would have ended there, it wouldn't have looked good for Nixon, but he probably would have survived that politically. But then they tried to cover it up, and that's when things got dicey. So here's and Chuck Colson was in the middle of this. He was Nixon's lawyer. He was the lawyer for the White House. So he was in the middle of this. And here's what he says. And I'm going to read a few pages here. Hang with me. This is good stuff. History reveals that the criminal investigation of the White House began as it did with John Dean, one of the inner circle for Nixon, with John Dean's April 8th meeting with the prosecutors. The end of Mr. Nixon's presidency was only a matter of time. The cover-up was discovered and doomed, and this is why the dates are so important. So John Dean told him everything. John Dean said, I'm going to save my own skin, and I'm going to tell you the truth of what happened. So the presidency was doomed at that point. And this is why the dates are so important. For though the cover-up technically dated back to the June 1972 break-in, the serious cover-up, the part everyone knew or should have known was criminal, really began March 21st, 1973, and it ended April 8th, 1973, so a matter of a couple of weeks later. With the most powerful office in the world at stake, a small band of hand-picked loyalists, no more than 10 of us, could not hold a conspiracy together for more than 2 weeks. Think of what was at stake. Each of us involved, Ehrlichman, Haldeman, Mitchell, and the rest, believed passionately in President Nixon. To enter government service for him, we had sacrificed very lucrative private law practices and other endeavors. We had sacrificed our family lives and privacy. We had invested our whole lives in the work, 24 hours a day if necessary. Only a few months earlier, the president had been reelected in an historic landslide victory. The ugly Asian War was finally over, Vietnam. We were riding the crest in every way. Think of the power at our fingertips. A mere command from one of us could mobilize generals and cabinet officers, even armies. We could hire or fire personnel and manage billions in agency budgets. Think of the privileges. A call to the military aids office would produce a limousine or jet airplane. The National Gallery delivered classic paintings to adorn our office walls. Red-jacketed stewards stood in waiting to serve food and drink 24 hours a day. Private phones appeared wherever we traveled. Secret servicemen were always within sight, as many as we wanted. Yet even the prospect of jeopardizing the president we'd worked so hard to elect, of losing the prestige, power, and personal luxury of our offices was not enough incentive to make this group of men contain a lie. Nor, as I reflect today, was the pressure really all that great. At that point, there had certainly been moral failures, criminal violations, even perjury, even lying by some. There was certain to be keen embarrassment. At the worst, some might go to prison, though that possibility was by no means certain. But no one was in grave danger. No one's life was at stake. Yet, after just a few weeks, the natural human instinct for self-preservation was so overwhelming that the conspirators, one by one, deserted their leader, walked away from their cause, turned their backs on the power, prestige, and privileges. So what does this have to do with the resurrection of Jesus? Simply this. Modern criticism of the historic truth of Christianity boils down to 3 propositions. First, the disciples were mistaken, or second, that the disciples knowingly perpetrated a myth intended as a symbol, or third, the 11 disciples conceived a Passover plot, a conspiracy. spirited the body of Christ out of the tomb and disposed of it neatly, and to their dying breaths maintained conspiratorial silence. Let's consider each, and I'm going to skip the first two and go down to this next one. This is why the Watergate experience is so instructive for me. If John Dean and the rest of us were so panic-stricken, not by the prospect of beatings and execution, but by political disgrace and possible prison term, one can only speculate about the emotions of the disciples. Unlike the men in the White House, the disciples were powerless, abandoned by their leader, homeless, and in a conquered land. Yet they clung tenaciously to their enormously offensive story that their leader had risen from his ignoble death and was alive and was the Lord. The Watergate cover-up reveals, I think, the true nature of humanity. None of the memoirs suggest, the books that the men wrote after the fact, that anyone went to the prosecutor's office out of such noble notions as putting the Constitution above the presidency or bringing rascals to justice or even moral indignation. Instead, the writings of those involved are consistent recitations of the frailty of man. Even political zealots in the pinnacle of power will save their own necks in the crunch, though it may be at the expense of the one they profess to serve so zealously. Is it really likely then that a deliberate cover-up, a plot to perpetuate a lie about the resurrection, could have survived the violent persecution of the apostles, the scrutiny of the early church councils, the horrendous purge of the first century believers who were cast to the thousands but to the lions for refusing to renounce the lordship of Christ? Is it not probable that at least one of the apostles would have renounced Christ before being beheaded or stoned? Is it not likely that some smoking gun document might have been produced exposing the Passover plot? Surely one of the conspirators would have made a deal with the authorities. Government and Sanhedrin probably would have welcomed such a soul with open arms and pocketbooks. Blaise Pascal, the extraordinary mathematician, scientist, inventor, and logician of the 17th century, was convinced of the truth of Christ by examination of the historical record in his classic Pensies. Pascal wrote, "The hypothesis that the apostles were knaves, idiots, and is quite absurd. Follow it out to the end and imagine these 12 men meeting after Jesus' death and conspiring to say that he had risen from the dead. This means attacking the powers that be. The human heart is singularly susceptible to fickleness, to change, to promises, to bribery. One of them had only to deny his story under these inducements, or still more because of the possible imprisonment, torture, and death, and they would have been lost. And they all would have been lost. As Pascal correctly observes, man in his normal state will renounce his beliefs just as readily as Peter renounced Jesus before the resurrection. But as the same Peter discovered after the resurrection, there is a power beyond man that causes him to forsake all. It is the power of the God who revealed himself in the person of Jesus Christ. The weight of the evidence tells me the apostles were indeed telling the truth. Jesus did rise bodily from the grave. He is who he says he is. So, the most powerful men in the world could not hold together a conspiracy for less than 3 weeks, protecting the most powerful man in the world. How could the disciples have done that now for over 2,000 years? None of the disciples denied Jesus, even though all, except for John, plus Paul, were martyred for their faith. And all of them suffered, even John. They suffered horrendous persecution for their faith. It isn't just that they died for what they believed. A lot of people have done that. People fly planes into buildings for what they believe. Lots of people have died for beliefs that were completely false. They died But the disciples are different. They weren't dying for what they believed. They died for what they believed they saw. And what they saw, what they knew they saw, was the living Christ, was the risen Christ. The disciples and other witnesses, more than 500 at one time, the disciples and others who witnessed Christ after his resurrection were in a unique position in all of history. They were in a position to know for a fact that the resurrection is true. Nobody would die for a lie that they know is a lie. The disciples proclaimed the resurrection to their deaths for one reason, and one reason only. They knew it was true. So here's the only possible answer. He arose. Christ is risen. There is only one explanation. Jesus Christ actually, physically, bodily rose from the dead. And if I would have been at the tomb that day, I could have taken a picture of it. It's a foundational truth that the Apostle Paul believed in and died for. If it's not true, then Christianity is worthless. Theologian Gerald Collins says, in a profound sense, Christianity without the resurrection is not simply Christianity without its final chapter. It's not Christianity at all. But it is true. We've just proven that. Now, here's something we haven't talked about. What is the purpose of the resurrection? You know, I know all the churchy answers. To give us power over sin and death, to raise us to newness of life. And those are true. But now I have a real life answer. I'm going to read to you from part of Lee Strobel's The Case for Easter. But before I do, you know, and I'm going to get emotional about this, you know this already from being in class with me. You know that I've lost both of my parents. I sat by the deathbed of both of my parents, my father with Alzheimer's, my mother with cancer. And it was through their deaths that I realized the true meaning of the resurrection. So Lee Strobel does a great job here. He's interviewing Gary Habermas, who you saw in the movie The Case for Christ, the parts of that interview. And I think you know also that his wife Debbie died. I think that's mentioned in the movie as well. So this is the interview. This is the story of the interview with Habermas, and this is what Lee Strobel writes. Before I left Habermas's office, however, I had one more question. Frankly, I hesitated to ask it because it was a bit too predictable, and I thought I'd get an answer that was a little too pat. The question concerned the importance of the resurrection. I figured if I asked Habermas about that, he'd give the standard reply about being the center of Christian doctrine, the axis around which the Christian faith turned. And I was right. He did give a stock answer like that. But what surprised me was that this wasn't all he said. This nuts and bolts scholar, this burly and straight shooting debater, this combat-ready defender of the faith, allowed me to peer into his soul as he gave an answer that grew out of the deepest valley of despair he had ever walked through. Habermas rubbed his graying beard. The quick-fire cadence and debater's edge to his voice were gone. No more quoting of scholars, no more citing of scripture, no more building a case. I had asked him about the importance of the resurrection, and Habermas decided to take a risk by describing what happened in 1995 when his wife Debbie slowly died of stomach cancer. Caught off guard by the tenderness of the moment, all I could do was listen. I sat on our porch, he began, looking off to the side at nothing in particular. He sighed deeply, then went on. My wife was upstairs dying. Except for a few weeks, she was home through it all. It was an awful time. This was the worst thing that could possibly happen. He turned to me, and he turned and looked straight at me. But do you know what was amazing? My students would call me, not just one, but several of them, and say, at a time like this, aren't you glad about the resurrection? As sober as those circumstances were, I had to smile for two reasons. First, my students were trying to cheer me up with my own teaching. And second, it worked. As I would sit there, I'd picture Job, who went through all that terrible stuff and asked questions of God, but then God turned the tables and asked him a few questions. I knew if God were to come to me, I'd ask only one question. Lord, why is Debbie up there in bed? And I think God would respond by asking gently, Gary, did I raise my son from the dead? I'd say, come on, Lord, I've written 7 books on the topic. Of course he was raised from the dead, but I want to know about Debbie. I think he'd keep coming back to the same question. Did I raise my son from the dead? Did I raise my son from the dead? Until I got his point. The resurrection says that if Jesus was raised 2,000 years ago, there's an answer to Debbie's death in 1995. And you know what? It worked for me while I was sitting on that porch. And it still works today. It was a horribly emotional time for me, but I couldn't get around the fact that the resurrection is the answer for her suffering. I still worried. I still wondered what I'd do raising 4 kids alone. But there wasn't a time when that truth didn't comfort me. Losing my wife was the most painful experience I've ever had to face. But if the resurrection could get me through that, it can get me through anything. It was good for 80-30. It was good for 1995. And it's good beyond that. Habermas locked eyes with mine. That's not some sermon, he said quietly. I believe it with all my heart. If there's a resurrection, there's a heaven. If Jesus raised Debbie, if Jesus was raised, Debbie will be raised. And I will be someday too. And then I'll see them both. Whew. Don't usually get emotional this early in this lecture. Losing my father was a crisis of faith like I've never known. Losing my mother was equally hard, but I'd already dealt with a crisis of faith. Here was my crisis of faith. I thought, what if it isn't true? What if I've handed my life over to a lie? What if there isn't a resurrection? What if there isn't a heaven? I struggled silently. Don't do that. Tell someone if you're struggling. I struggled for a long time, maybe a couple of years with that. And you know, one reason how I know it is true is that through that whole struggle, through that whole spiritual wrestling match, God never let me go. He just kept coming back with, did I raise my son? And I believe that to the core of my being, that Jesus Christ is risen. Did I raise my son? That was and is my answer. I believe it with all my heart. If there's a resurrection, there's a heaven. If Jesus is raised, my daddy is raised, and my mother is raised, or will be raised. And I will be someday too. And then I'll see all 3 of them. Amen? Let's pray. Father, thank you for the truth of the resurrection. Thank you that Christ is risen. He is risen indeed. May we each find our hope, especially in these disturbing times. Our hope not just for today, but our hope for forever in this truth. We love you and praise you in Jesus' name.